So let's start with basic responsibilities of a board. Quick question. How many of you are currently or have in the past served on a board? Anybody? Ooh, many of you. Perfect. All right. How many of you love serving on boards? Not as many of you. Okay. So, one of the biggest challenges that I find in the work that I do is often when I engage with an organization, um, usually they don't call a consultant unless they need to create a change, or perhaps there's some tension happening in the organization, some sort of a challenge. So when I walk into situations, I'm usually there because there's some sort of a challenge or there's a need for change or something along those lines. And what I often find is there's tension between the board and the staff. And I have over 30-ish years of doing this work realized that that tension often arises because there's confusion about people's roles. Whose job is it? Like, what's the job of the board? What's the job of individual board members? What's the job of the staff? Those types of questions. So, I used to say that I was 95% certain that all challenges in a nonprofit stem from a mismatch of board relationship. I now am 100% convinced that when a nonprofit starts to implode or runs into challenges, it's often related to this question. I would say 100% of the time, this is part of the issue. So I want to start with just getting some shared language and some shared context so that we can all agree to say, here's how we think about boards. Sound good? All right. I got a pop quiz for you. We're going to try to make this work. What is the difference between a working board and a governing board? Shout out your answers. Pardon? Money? Okay. Some may think funding. Working boards get paid. What else? What are some other ideas? Okay, so a working board does the actual work, and a governing board does, okay, bylaws, directs things. Okay, what else? Okay, so working boards tend to be younger organizations, maybe organizations that don't have a lot of staff. Okay, and as an organization grows and develops, perhaps they lean more into being a governing board. All right, this is a little bit of a trick question because guess what? There really isn't a difference. They are not two separate things. This is my pet peeve in the nonprofit sector, and I am on a personal mission to change this in philanthropy because I hear this all the time. I want my board to be a working board, or I want my board to be a governing board. They're way too much of a working board. How do I change that? They are not two different things. By legal definition, a nonprofit board of directors is a governing body. Here's the caveat to this. They're not two different things, but individual board members work at different levels within an organization. So I want to walk through those levels just to, again, create some shared language in how we talk about this work. So we're going to talk a little bit about the institutional level, the managerial level, and the technical level that board members work at. So when we think about this institutional level of work, this is where the board as a body is the governing body of the organization. When I say board as a body, that means that governance responsibility happens when we have a board meeting. Individual board members don't carry the governance authority nor the full responsibility when they're out there operating on their own. It's a distinction we have to be thoughtful about because sometimes in bylaws we have things like the board chair oversees the executive director. The whole board does. The body does. Or we have things like the executive committee can make decisions in between board meetings. The whole board is the governing body and needs to make decisions. Executive committee has no authority. And if you put things like that in your bylaws, you're truncating your board and you're also bumping into potential legal issues. So we want to be thoughtful about how this works. So what does it mean to be at this institutional level? The board is in charge. There's a hierarchical structure. The governing body's here, the CEO is here. There's a hierarchy. Hierarchies aren't bad by definition. They can get really nasty if we're not thoughtful, but they're not bad by definition. This is where we have the legal fiduciary responsibility. How many of people have heard this idea of fiduciary? What do we think it means? Fiduciary goes beyond money. According to the IRS, which is one of the federal agencies, the Attorney General also plays a part in this, that oversees nonprofits, and when nonprofit law is violated, they get involved. So according to the IRS, this idea of fiduciary comes with these 3 duties: duty of care, loyalty, and obedience. So when we think about the legal responsibility, the fiduciary responsibility, which according to the IRS gets into ethics, right? When we think about that as the responsibility of this hierarchical structure, duty of care basically says we are going to hold and trust for the community this organization's mission. We're going to make sure that it's taken well care of. We're going to tend to the resources. This is where we tend to think about money, right? We're going to make sure that we have the financial resources and the human resources to do our work, right? Duty of loyalty says this is why we encourage nonprofit organizations to have a conflict of interest statement that board members review and sign every year. Not just once when they join the board, but actually look at it and re-sign it every year. A conflict of interest policy protects an organization for this duty of loyalty. Basically, all it says is if I, as an individual board member, am sitting in the boardroom and a conversation comes up that I might have some personal or business stake in, I have a duty to disclose that and step away from the conversation. And we note it in our minutes. So if you've ever been part of a nonprofit organization that's gone through an audit, one of the things they ask to see is the board book. And the board book includes all the agendas and minutes and supporting material from every board meeting. What is the auditor looking for? They're not just looking at your financial statements because they get all of those. They're looking to see how you're doing with your duty of care, loyalty, and obedience. So when you think about how do we take board meeting minutes, we want to think about what's included. Now, you don't have to literally scribe every single solitary word that comes out of people's mouths, but you do need to say, here's a decision we made. Here are the key things that we talked about in making that decision. And if anybody disclosed a potential conflict, we note that in the bylaws. That protects the organization legally. Okay? And this idea of duty of obedience is how are we prudent when it comes to obeying the law? What laws do we have to obey as a nonprofit? Federal laws, so anything related to being a 501c3 organization. What else? Each state has some separate laws, mostly around fundraising, but some other things that we have to think about and how we disclose information. We also are legally bound to obey our own bylaws, and this is the number one place that we see ignored. Want to know the number one thing that people ignore in their bylaws? Term limits. Oh, we have term limits. We don't enforce them. When clients say that to me, I'm like, you're violating the law. And they're like, what? Technically speaking, you are. You're violating your duty of obedience. So we have to understand what are the laws that govern a nonprofit. Now, if you're sitting on a board and you don't understand the laws that are governing a nonprofit organization, and you make a decision that bumps into that, what happens? I've sat on a board that was sued twice. Once for breach of contract because we broke a contract with someone. And the other was because it was actually when I was with the Grand Rapids JCs. We were sued twice. Once when we decided to move our golf tournament to a different golf course. The golf course we were leaving sued us because they didn't want to lose the contract. And another time we did, I'm old, so this was a long time ago when when the programs were really common to do like the gun buyback and turn in the guns, we did one of those programs and we got sued over it. No one got hurt, nothing happened, but we got sued over the program. So what we had to do was go back to our meeting minutes and talk about how did we make this decision. Neither one resulted in any issues for board members or the organization. Both were settled. Both turned out to be nonsensical, but we still had to deal with the process of being sued. So this is also why we encourage organizations to have officer and directors or directors and officers, depending on who you talk to, OD or D&O insurance, so that when you're a board member, you're not personally liable should the organization get sued. When people ask me to serve on a board, that's always my first question. Do you have OD insurance? And if they say, what's that? I'm sorry, but I can't serve on your board. And my second question always is, can I see the last 6 months of your financial reports? And they're like, really? Uh-huh. I want to know what I'm getting into. So when we think about this institutional level, this is the legal responsibility for the board of directors as a body, right? So we move on and we think about this managerial level. Here's the reality of nonprofits in the United States. Most of them are small. Over 80% of nonprofit organizations in this country have budgets of less than $100 or $1 million. Of that, the vast majority of those have budgets less than $500,000. And something like 2/3 of nonprofits in this country have either a 0.5 full-time equivalent staff person or none at all.
Just to go back to
Yeah.
what you said about you request the last 6 months of financial reports, why do you
I do. Because I've sat in boards that they showed me 1 month and the organization was stable and in good shape, but I didn't realize that had I looked back through history, and then the board ended up being sort of stuck with really difficult financial decisions, and I just don't want to put myself in that position again. So, yeah.
any key things to look at?
Make sure they can pay their bills. And if they have staff, that the check's actually clear. So, yeah. And also make sure the budget lines up with strategy and programs, right? I was working with an organization recently and they were talking about their strategy and they were telling me one of their strategies was to invest in something. And I said, interesting, because we just looked at the budget and nowhere in the budget do you have a line item for that. So how can you say that's a strategy when you have no line item in your budget to support it? We're not going to put any resources to it. It's probably not important, right? So when we think about this managerial level, the reality is most nonprofits are small. The point was made earlier when we think about fiduciary responsibility versus a working board, size matters, age of the organization matters, right? We typically see large institutions like Grand Valley State University, the Salvation Army, hospitals. Larger institutions tend to have a lot of employees, so their boards don't necessarily get engaged at these other levels. They sit at the institutional level and very rarely move beyond that. But again, not the reality for most nonprofits. So we need board members to actually get engaged in the day-to-day work. Now, that doesn't mean come into the office and manage things day-to-day, because that gets messy. But it does mean engage in committee work and think about how do we help to ensure that the work of the organization gets done and that our mission is met. So we usually do that through committees. When we're working in committees as a board member, we have to think about partnership. This represents a shift. Remember, when the board calls a meeting to order and I'm sitting in a boardroom, it's hierarchy. We're the boss. When I go into this managerial level of work, it's partnership. I am no longer overseeing, I'm working next to and with, right? We also have to think about the fact that when an individual board member comes into a committee meeting, they do not carry the authority of the institutional board with them. Now, what I've seen in a lot of organizations is board members sit in committee meetings and they basically give a to-do list to the executive director. Not a good way to run a committee meeting. Committees are designed for people on those committees to remove some of the detailed work and some of the things that need to be done from the executive director so they can focus their time and energy elsewhere. So when you're sitting in a committee meeting, you don't have the authority of the board, and you have to be thoughtful about that. You do have some fiduciary carryover, because if an individual board member does not act with care, loyalty, and obedience in a committee meeting, it can raise some potential legal issues. You have to be thoughtful because you're listed as a board member, right? So you have to be thoughtful about that. Then we have, oh, I apologize. I evidently have a typo in my slide deck. This should say technical level. So I don't know. So I will fix that before I send it to you. It's funny, you look at these things so much and you just don't even notice. So then we move to this technical level. When we're thinking about the technical level, in this situation, we often have an individual board member reporting to staff. The individual is a volunteer. They don't come in with the authority. They're a volunteer like any other volunteer in the organization. Now, what I sometimes see in organizations is an individual board member will go and volunteer in the organization, and then they start hearing the chatter. Like someone complains about something, they'll hear a little chatter, and then it raises all of the alarm bells, and they go, "Oh my gosh, there's something wrong. We have to bring our executive director in and slap them on the hands because they've done something wrong." It's like, no, maybe you need to go to the ED and say, I'm hearing some chatter. Maybe we need to be thoughtful about what's happening with the staff or with the volunteers, and let's talk about what's going on, right? Different response, not usually the common response. Again, a little fiduciary carryover. So we want to be thoughtful about that. So let's use Treetops as an example. Treetops has a board. Any board members here from Treetops? Vigorously shaking his head. So I'm assuming the board meets at some sort of a regular, whether it's quarterly, every other month, monthly. Okay, every month. They have board meetings. We call a meeting to order. We're doing our institutional level of work. Do board members serve on committees and help get work done? So what happens when you serve on a committee as a board member? Okay. You just one more hand on the committee. Yep, you just come into that room. You act as any other committee member. You're volunteering your time and energy. What about this idea of technical? Like my former colleague from the Johnson Center, Mandy Sharp-Eisinger, I believe used to be the board chair, if I remember correctly, here at Treetops. And I remember her talking about helping with a capital campaign because she had the technical skill to help with a capital campaign. But when she did that work, she wasn't walking in with this authority. She was just saying, well, I happen to have this skill set. Can I come help with the capital campaign? Think about how we organize it, all of those types of things, because she and I used to talk about this at the office. So, and she was just a volunteer in that situation. She wasn't coming in and saying, well, because I'm board chair, I'm going to tell you exactly what you have to do. Now, I can tell you the reverse side of that when it doesn't work well. So I used to work at an organization that I will not name because this is on tape and it's going to end up on YouTube and God only knows where. So I won't mention any names, but I used to work in an organization that when I came to the organization as the executive director, they had spent many years actually, the board ran the organization. They didn't have any paid staff. So that created different things in the culture and there were different dynamics, right? The board kind of did all of this. So when I came and we started talking about what's the distinction between the roles, my job versus your job, and how do we navigate some of that? We had an individual on the board that was used to being part of every single solitary decision. So my job description and the bylaws and our policies all stated like I was supposed to take care of our physical building. I could spend up to $1,000 without anybody's approval. And then there was sort of a step, $1,000 to $2,500 had to go to a committee, $2,500 over had to go to the board. We had a very old building that needed some updating, and we were just trying to make little changes so that it felt more welcoming and warm and comfortable, and you want people to feel a sense of dignity when they come into a space. And so I had a volunteer who was a professional painter, and we got talking one day about painting the entryway. She's like, "Oh my gosh, I'll do it for free if you just buy the paint." Cool. We talked to several people, put paint swatches up on the wall, decided on the paint. She comes in and paints it. A board member asked the board for a special meeting and requested that I be fired because I didn't ask her what color the paint should be. Real story. Everybody always laughs sort of uncomfortably when I tell that story, and it seems absurd. But where was the role? And I went to the board when I found out that this had happened, and I said, "Help me understand where I violated our bylaws or policy or what I did that was against my job description." And they all kind of looked at me like, nothing. Then why did you entertain the conversation? You literally entertained this conversation. So what happened then? We broke trust. Once you break trust, that's hard to get back, right? So when you think about moving in and out of these different levels of work, the arrows represent the shift in relationship. And that's what's important for people to think about. Did you have a question? Okay. Yeah. Pardon me? No. No. But I did have a really hard conversation with the board, and it actually started about a year and a half of really hard conversations. And part of it was they didn't know how to work with staff. They had never done it before. So this is why I say I think this is the root of all problems in nonprofits, because we see people moving in and out of these different levels of work, all well-intentioned, all with a heart and a passion for the work, right? But they don't understand the role has shifted, the relationship has shifted, and I can't take this authority over here, right? Because this authority and responsibility rest with the body. And that's the key that we have to remember. So be thoughtful about how your bylaws are written. Who do you give authority to? It was actually written in our board policy that no individual board member has authority over the executive director. Like they literally wrote a line that said that. So we have to be thoughtful about how these things are never. Yeah, I'm not sure why the lights keep going off and on, but okay. So we have to be thoughtful about that.
I do have a question. So, like, if a faith institute falls under the 501c,
Yep.
all of this would apply to them as well?
Yes. So when we say a faith organization, are we thinking a congregation, a mosque or a church or a synagogue? So here's the interesting little tidbit about the law with 501c3s. In the state of Michigan, when you file for a congregation, there's special paperwork you fill out as your nonprofit corporation, but I can't remember the actual term for it, but there's a term for the type of nonprofit corporation that you are in the state of Michigan. Technically, the IRS considers all of religious institutions that are congregational, meaning you have regular service, right? This doesn't apply if you're like a faith-based nonprofit organization, but you're not doing congregational services, right? But if you have congregational services, the IRS actually recognizes all of those entities as charitable C3s, whether or not they file their federal paperwork. So in the US, I believe there's roughly 50, I think last time I looked was maybe 55% of congregations, meaning, a house of worship where you have regular meetings, faith meetings. About 55% do file their federal paperwork to be a 501c3 because it makes it easier when we're doing certain things to have the letter. But technically, the IRS considers them all to be C3s. So if you read the law, okay. Any other questions about this before we move on? So, okay, is that all that a board does? No, right? There's lots of different literature out there. Lately, sort of what's become pretty common in the sector is to talk about the 5 T's. So we think about our time, talent, treasure, ties, and testimony. So this goes kind of beyond the fiduciary legal aspect. This goes a little bit beyond work we might do with a committee or volunteering. In some regards, this idea of talent is where we might do that technical level of work, right? We get engaged because we have a particular talent or skill to offer to the organization. But when we think about the 5 T's, this is just an easy way to have conversations with a board to say, what do you do anyway, right? Because a lot of people recruit board members and they don't actually tell them what their job is. And then we get confusion. And then we either have, I'll have an executive director say to me, my board doesn't do anything. How'd you recruit them? Well, what difference does that make? Did you recruit them with an expectation of service? Did they understand what they were getting into? Did you actually give them you don't have to call it a job description. You can, but you don't have to. Did you give them something in writing that says this is what we expect out of board members? Did you set any clear roles? And usually I'll get a blank stare. It's like, okay, I'm assuming the answer to that question is no. That's why your board's not doing anything. Or we get people frustrated. Now, here's the interesting thing, and I hear this a lot too. People of my generation, so I'm officially a senior citizen this year. I turned 62. I always forget to ask for the discounts, but I gotta remember. So my generation, I'm sort of on the cusp, but I'm technically a boomer, right? Even though I identify with the generation after the boomers a little more. Technically, I'm a boomer. Now, here's the thing about boomers. Boomers, if you send them a sappy letter and they tug at their heartstrings, they're going to give you a gift. That's just what they do. That's what we're trained to do, especially at year end, right? I'll tell you, the Salvation Army, when I was at the division many, many, many years ago, one of the things I did was I oversaw a $5.3 million direct mail campaign. The Salvation Army has that down like nobody's business. They do it well. So my generation is fine with that. Younger generations, like your generations, not so much. So I hear all the time from people, young people don't want to give money. False. All the research tells us they actually give at the same level, if not more, of their parents. Here's the caveat. Their on-ramp to a financial gift looks different. They want to be involved. They want to use their time, their talent, their ties, their story, their testimony. How do I talk about the work? I want to see that my time and my talents are treasured. I want to know that you actually will listen to me and care about my opinion. And I can get involved and I can, quote unquote, get my hands dirty. I can do the work. Then I'll write you a check. But not until I get a chance to get involved and see what's going on and really get connected. My generation, we don't have a problem starting here, but it's really hard to get us to do anything else. Right? So we have to pay attention to that when we're recruiting board members. Different expectations of different generations, different expectations from different lived experiences, because there's cultural context for things. So we have to be thoughtful about that, right? Here's the other caveat of this. Being a board member at the Salvation Army looks different than being a board member at Treetops, looks different than being a board member at the school down the street, looks different than being a board member at the pantry that the church started, looks different from being a board member at name any other organization. So if someone says to you, I've served on like 7 boards, and you get them on your board and you say, wow, I just got a really good board. I hear this a lot. I just recruited a really good board member. I'm so excited. I said, what makes them a good board member? Oh my gosh, they've been on 7 boards. Cool. What was the board experience like? Well, I don't know. I didn't ask that. They've just been on 7 boards. Did you talk to them about what it means to be a board member for your organization? Because what those 7 boards were doing might look really different than what you need them to do. And this is where we bump into challenges, right? So here's my 2 cents worth of advice to you. Be really, really clear when you are recruiting board members. Talk to them before they say yes about what the job really is. Now, I personally, during my career, almost always had a written job description. Sometimes I called it a board job description. Sometimes I would call it a board commitment. Sometimes I would call it, I don't know, other things, depending on the organization. And I asked board members to read through it and sign it when they decided to be a board member. And we would take them out every year and look at it. What did I include in that job description? I like bullet points. If you ever want to email me, please email short and sweet. I used to tell my staff all the time, I had one staff person that literally would write novels. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm not going to read it. Give me the bullet points. Like, what do you actually want me to do? Right? So bullet points, because that's me, right? That's my bent, my preference, my bias, if you will. So what I would do is on the top of the page, it would say, I understand that in order to be an effective board member for XYZ organization, I'm going to spend an average of X number of months. Put a number in there. Is it going to be 5 hours a month? Is it going to be 10 hours a month on average? What do you need? As a volunteer, think about this. Wouldn't you rather know going into a volunteer role what the expectations really are, as opposed to getting surprised later and being frustrated because it doesn't quite fit? I joined a board a couple of years ago, little teeny tiny nonprofit, like a messed up tiny little organization. And I thought I had a clear idea of what the expectations were. After 4 months, I was so incredibly frustrated. After 6 months, I actually resigned my board position, which I've never done before. The caveat is, I said to the volunteer executive director, I love what you're trying to do. I can't function in this chaos, like I just can't. But I'm happy to help you whenever you need it. So I've been a coach for her for free. I've done all kinds of things. Yesterday, I spent half the day with her board, her current board, about how do we think about planning for the future. So I invest in other ways in the organization, but I just couldn't. I'm like, my brain does not compute with this. And it just frustrates me. And I know I was frustrating other people because I was trying to bring them into, like, let's function like a actual board. Like, how do we move this? And they weren't ready. And that's okay. So you have to know what you're getting into. I personally, as an executive director, would much rather have someone know what they're getting into and have them say, you know what, it's not for me. Okay. Are there other ways you can support the organization? Just because someone's not a board member doesn't mean they can't engage and support your organization. This is my big frustration with term limits. People say, we don't want term limits. We have all this history. Oh my gosh, they're so great to our organization, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, okay, when they leave their board, do you bar them from ever entering your organization again? Like, do they have an order that says they can't come in the door ever again? Seriously, just because they're not a board member doesn't mean they can't be involved. Find another way to use their skills and their talent. But we get stuck on if they're not on the board, oh my gosh. And if they have all the organizational history, shame on you. Put it somewhere, document it, write it down. Make sure more than one person knows how to do the thing, right? So,
What other things should be on the board description? So you said monthly.
oh, yes. So then I'll do bullet points. I am not a give, get, or get off person, meaning I don't believe, and I know there are organizations in Grand Rapids that do this. I won't name them because we're on tape and this will be out in the world. But there are organizations in Grand Rapids that do require. One board that someone was telling me about has a $10,000 minimum gift. And I'm like, I'm I'm sorry, I have a decent job and I can't afford to give this organization a $10,000 gift. Like, who do you put on your board? You know, we talk about wanting to diversify our boards and actually represent our community, and then we throw up all these barriers to actually have anybody serve on the board. So I encourage people to say a meaningful gift. What is meaningful to me might look really different than what is meaningful to you, and that's okay. I encourage that in there. It talks about give a meaningful gift annually. Attend at least 75% of the board meetings. Because guess what? If you can never show up, maybe you need to do something else in the organization. We need you to show up. We need you to govern, do the job, right? Things like keeping information confidential, so that as we're talking about things in the boardroom, we know that information in the boardroom is confidential. Supporting the executive director. Now, that might be a volunteer executive. That might be a paid executive. Somewhere in between, right? They get paid when we can afford to pay them. Please don't do that. That's hard. But so kind of think through what do we need in our organization? But it's those types of things. And then on the bottom of the form, I always put XYZ organization. We'll pick on Treetops. Treetops will ensure that as a board member, you have another list. You have the information you need to make the best possible decisions. You have now, if I do this, and like if I'm in a faith-based organization, because that's kind of the world I come out of, is a lot of faith-based organizations. Sometimes in the ministries that I worked with, we would put in there that we would provide spiritual support. So please call us with your prayer request, right? Again, what fits your organization? But the bottom of the page would be, here's what the organization is going to provide you, because guess what? This is a two-way street. If your board members are not successful, shame on the organization. I don't look at the board member and go, oh, you're all wrong. Now, sometimes it is a board member, it is the individual. Often, we haven't done a good job of actually clarifying and helping people understand what their job is, nor have we equipped them to do it. So if you say you want your board members, you want your board to be educated about the nonprofit sector, and you do nothing to provide the education, I'm sorry, did you really expect them to go figure it out on their own? Build education into the work. 15, 20 minutes at a board meeting. Do something to educate them. Put a little bit of money in your budget and say, hey, you can go take a class at the Johnson Center. They're not expensive and they're really good training. Send them to a conference if you can afford to. Right? So any question? Do we still have people online? Okay. Anything online that we need to address before we move on? Okay. Other questions before we move past this?
So normally the board members are listed, right? And it's in document. So
Yes.
someone who's not a board member, can they randomly just like come in and make decisions on the board, even though they're not?
Legally, no, not if they haven't been voted in to be a board member. 501c3s are interesting because we don't fall under Open Meetings Acts like government institutions do. And yet they are considered like community organizations. So if a member of the community comes in and says, I want to see this, that, or the other thing, there's a lot you legally have to comply with. Like they can look at your audit, they can look at stuff. They're allowed, they're public charities. So there is that opportunity. But no non-board member should be making decisions for the organization. I mean, unless it's staff, right? I should caveat. Also, paid staff should not be board members. Conflict of interest right there. And I see it all the time. Like, there's a couple of large institutions in this community that I was shocked to see that their CEO of a very large institution is a voting board member. But the board's your boss. Isn't there a conflict of interest with every single solitary vote you take? Like, staff, CEOs should be part of board meetings. Remember, it's partnership. You should always be working on partnership. Staff should absolutely have a relationship with the board, but there's boundary lines and caveats around that. But if someone's not a board member, they don't have a right to make decisions for the organization. Well, you can allow people to come into your board meeting, people in your community. If you want to hear from the community, that's certainly fine to do, but be really careful about who makes decisions. Yeah. Oh, she was asking, could people who are not board members come into the boardroom and make decisions or potentially listen in on things? Absolutely, it's fine if you want to have people come in and listen. But be really thoughtful about what role they play in the conversation. Yeah.
Usually, and I don't know if it's going that way, we invite people to our board meetings, possible board members,
Mhm.
people that might know about something, but they never, ever are when we're
Right.
voting or in the decision making.
Right.
They need to leave the room. And
Yes.
if it's something that is affecting the executive director, the executive will walk out of the room and
Yeah.
the board will make the decision because
Yeah.
obviously there's a conflict of
Right.
interest over there.
Yeah, and absolutely, there are times like if you're recruiting someone and they're thinking about being on the board, they may want to come sit in on a board meeting. But what parts do they sit in on? What parts don't they? They don't engage. They don't offer a vote. They're not involved. There may be times where you want community members to come in for the board to learn more about the community that you're working with and have conversation. But again, where's that boundary line? Where do they engage? So, has anybody ever experienced a dysfunctional nonprofit board? I'll take that as a yes. We don't have to name names. So, again, as a volunteer, wouldn't you want to enter into a volunteer role that's healthy, that feels good when you go, that you're excited to show up? Like, I think we all want that. Is that a fair? Yeah. When you are faced with a dysfunctional board, which there's a lot of them out there. Hide the camera now. So there are a lot of them out there. All over the country. It's not just a West Michigan thing. So I'm going to walk through 5 steps to help you build a healthy board that are related to recruitment right? Because often we might think thoughtfully about recruitment, but then once they join the board, it's like, hey, you're on your own. Figure it out, right? So it starts with thinking about assessment. So some of us might have been engaged in a process where we have a lovely grid that we put on an Excel spreadsheet and we put all the board members' names on one side. I see a few people have done this. And then across the top, we have lots of different things, demographics, skills, lots of different stuff. And we check and we go, oh, here's a picture. Where are the gaps? Let's go find those people. We need somebody who knows how to raise money on our board. Let's go find somebody. Or we need an attorney, or we need a tax person, or whatever it is, right? Hopefully we pay attention to age. Now, we've all probably seen that type of an assessment. Those are okay. They're a piece of the work that we need to do, but there's a bigger process here. So we really have to think about what is the emotional intelligence going on in our boardroom? Especially if you say, well, we want to diversify our board. Do you really? If your board is all over 65, do you really want a 20-something coming in and asking all the questions that you just don't want to answer? It doesn't always go well. We have to think about emotional intelligence and culture. Now, I am not suggesting, because I do think this terminology is often used as a way of not being inclusive. It's not about, oh, we must have a quote unquote cultural fit, because usually that is secret terminology for I want people who look exactly like me and think like me on the board. And if they don't, they're not a cultural fit. Wrong answer. This is really about taking time as an organization to say, what does our culture look like in the boardroom? Is it healthy? Do people feel included? Do we have all of our little cliques like high school and nobody actually feels like they're part of the board? And the new person comes in and nobody talks to them. Or the 20-something comes into our room when everybody's over 55 and they ask a question and everyone looks at them with their head turned like this, as though they've just grown a horn or a third eye. And then we move on and just sort of ignore it because we don't even know what to do with the question. Those are culture problems. Those are social and emotional intelligence issues. So when we're talking about assessment, it's not just let's do the grid. And I'm not saying don't do the grid. There are ways where it can be helpful, but don't stop there. Right? Think about yes, we want to think about the grid, the skills, and the demographic. But more importantly, do we have an inclusive boardroom? How do we talk about the people that we serve in our boardroom? Do we have an us and them sort of an attitude? Because I hear that a lot. I remember working with an organization that I loved that the board had this aha moment, and it wasn't me saying it. We were having this conversation one day at a board meeting and talking about how we had this us and them attitude throughout our organization. Us, the organization, we're giving all this stuff to those people in the community. Those people are so needy. And somebody in the room posed the question and said, but wait, doesn't the gift and the need have equal value? That shifted everything for our organization. Because we got talking about that and we started picking at it and we started saying, what does that mean with the language that we use? What does that mean with the hoops that we make people jump through when they come in for assistance? What does that mean when we sit down and have a conversation? What information are we collecting? Why do we need it? How many times are we going to re-traumatize someone by making them say the story 6 times before we actually help them? Right? The need and the gift have equal value. So what does that look like in your boardroom? Does your board understand that? Has your board had some cultural training? Has your board, now the reality is, I'm sure this isn't true of this particular group, but the reality is in the United States, over 80% of our boards are still what? White, male, over 55. So if you're an organization that you're serving people who maybe have experienced homelessness or are experiencing homelessness, and nobody on your board has ever even had that experience, they don't even know anybody who's ever had that experience. And they start making decisions. Well, no, they have to come in and they have to show up this, and this paperwork. And, I don't think we should give them more than a week's worth of groceries. I mean, they probably have SNAP benefits, probably not if they don't have an address, but that's a whole nother conversation. Not to mention that SNAP benefits don't give you toilet paper and deodorant and laundry soap and all of those other lovely things that we need day to day. And if you're a woman, good luck taking care of those needs every month, right? So, does your board understand that? Or do you hear comments in the boardroom if you happen to run a pantry, things like, did you see that guy come into the pantry? He was talking about going golfing. What is he doing here in the pantry if he's going golfing? I've heard those conversations in a boardroom. What are those people doing coming here and asking for help when they're driving that kind of a car? Well, for all you know, it could be their neighbors and they had to borrow it to come and pick up their groceries. We don't know. And guess what? If they're driving an Audi, who cares? They still need food, right? What are the conversations that you're having in the boardroom? And are you talking about them? Are you saying, what does it look like? Before we say, let's go out and diversify our board. Do you know what diversifying most boards looks like in the nonprofit sector? Adding a woman. And if we have the courage, we might recruit a person of color. And then you know what happens after about 6 months? Because I hear this all the time too. Well, we tried that and it didn't work. Did you do this work first? And don't add one person of color because nobody wants to be the one. Bring on a couple and actually talk to them and listen to their voice and make them feel included and part of the group, right? But the minute we bump into a cultural difference, I'm a white girl, so I'm going to say this. White people are really good at shutting down. That didn't work. We're just going to move on to the next. And guess what? White people have that privilege. So if the vast majority of boardrooms in this country are white, what do we replicate over and over again? Or we don't take time to think about what's our recruitment plan. Then what happens? Joe brings his neighbor, and guess what? His neighbor looks like him, thinks like him, right? Where do we show up as an organization? How do we engage in community? How do we actually touch and feel and know what the people that we're serving experience? So we have to do all of that work before we can think about going out and recruiting. So when we think about assessment, do the work in the boardroom. Ask the hard questions, have the hard conversations. Then, once we've done that, then we can start to think about, okay, how do we actually recruit board members? Please don't just ask everybody in the boardroom to go find someone. Or if you're leaving, your job is to replace yourself. Because here's the reality. Human beings by nature tend to hang out with people that look like them and think like them. If we're going to do something different, there has to be intentionality, usually in doing something different, right? So in the wake of George Floyd's murder, like we got really thoughtful about, well, I don't know that we got thoughtful. We got really interested in DEI programming. Now we're barely 4 years later. Guess what's happening? Everybody's shutting down their DEI offices. I live in Ottawa County. Again, this is being recorded, so I can't say much, but I heard the gasp. Yes, I feel that way every day. Every day, right? So you want to see a clown show? Holland Sentinel does a great job reporting on it. So when we think about recruiting, it has to be more than, Holland, would you just go find someone to take your seat on the board since you're going to be done next year? It's easy. Just tell them they have to show up every month at a meeting. No big deal. In the boardroom with staff, you should be having a conversation to say, how do we recruit board members? What does that look like? So one organization that I was with, we had a lot of volunteers in our organization, which meant every month we had a volunteer orientation. So we decided, we wrote, it was a half-page document, nothing big, but we wrote a document that said, before anyone can be considered to be as a board member, they must have gone through a volunteer orientation. They must have served with us as a volunteer for at least 6 months, actually show up and do something, right? We have a couple of other, they have to have a meeting with a member of the executive committee and the executive director to go over the board recruitment packet. We had a little packet, 10-cent duotang folder. They might be 25 cents now. I haven't bought them in a while. So when we think about recruitment, we wrote a list and we said, here's what a potential board member has to go through. And we had an interview process for our board members. Thank you. We had an actual interview process for board members that said, here's what you have to do.
And we gave them an opportunity to ask questions. And then we started saying, where does our organization show up in community? Why do we end up with a board who looks exactly like our old board did? Because we as an organization don't show up in different spaces. What meetings do we show up at? Where do we connect? Because again, human beings, we are wired, physiologically wired to hang out with people who look like us, sound like us, think like us. So we have to kind of fight against them if we're actually going to recruit a diverse board. So that means being thoughtful. Where do we show up? What's our process? Doing the interviews. Training starts here. This means somebody should have a sense of our history. Now, we don't have to tell them the whole ball of wax. They're not a board member yet. But we want them to understand what it means to be a board member for our organization. If they say, oh, I've served on 8 boards, I know what I'm doing. That's awesome. And being a board member for our organization might look a little bit different. So humor me. Let me help you understand what it looks like to be a board member in our organization. Maybe we make decisions differently in the boardroom and we don't use this thing that everybody calls Robert's Rules of Order, because I hate to bring it to you, nobody actually uses Robert's Rules of Order. Please take that out of your bylaws if it's in there, because Robert's Rules are about the spec. Nobody does it. How do you make decisions in the boardroom? You don't have to say, let's put a motion on the floor, have a second, have a discussion, vote. Nobody says you have to do it that way, but you should have a way of making decisions. And it should be documented and consistent. And it might be different culturally. I once was asked to review the bylaws for a First Nations nonprofit in northern Michigan. It was the most beautiful document I've ever read in my life. It came with a glossary because the entire structure of the organization was structured after a tribe. And you want to know the best part? When push came to shove, if final decisions needed to be made, guess who got to make them? The elder women. I'll vote for that anytime. Right? But it was a beautifully written document that really reflected who they were as an organization and their culture. But if you bring someone who doesn't have the lived experience, they may not know what to do with that, right? I've spent the past year working with a client out of Chicago that is a Muslim organization. It has been amazing. I've been in so many Muslim spaces this past year, and as a practicing Christian, that's been a real learning journey for me because it's not my lived experience. I was telling Amina that I had an opportunity in January with my client to go on a Muslim educational and cultural tour in the Gambia and Senegal. Beautiful experience. But when I was asked to go, I said, yes, and she said, what's the and? And I said, I want to talk to the tour coordinators because I don't want to be a barrier to anybody on that trip. So we talked about culturally, what does it mean to have a Christian as part of this group? Culturally, what does it mean for me going into predominantly Muslim countries and visiting mosques? And tell me how I should dress. Tell me what I need to be thoughtful about. Tell me where I might bump into culture challenges because I don't want to offend somebody unbeknowingly, right? So are we willing to do that in our boardrooms when we start talking about diversity in a boardroom? Most of us are not. We're either not willing or we're not good at it. So I'm going to go backwards a second because I forgot I had stuck this slide in there because this was actually a last minute ad today. I was in a meeting today and somebody brought this up and I'm like, oh, I like that. So I decided to pop it in here. You may look this up. This is Board Source. It's a little 2-page document. You can download it for free. You don't have to be a member. And it talks about taking action on board diversity. And they have 5 questions. And I just really liked these questions. And if nothing else, ponder this in your boardroom, right? Think about it. So is the organization's reputation being negatively or positively impacted by the board's current composition? Talking about diversity. Years ago, I did a training for a statewide agency. We were on the other side of the state and we had maybe 50 people in a room, and I was doing a pretty long form board training, lots of depth and other stuff beyond what we're talking about tonight. And when I was talking about your board should look like your community, it should represent those that you serve. And one man in the back of the room, white, lots of gray hair, wore the proper business suit and all. This was a few years ago. That was more common. Says, are you really telling me that those people should serve on our board? And I said, well, if by those people, you mean people who have gone through programs, yeah, I think it'd be a great idea, but you culturally have to be ready to do that so you don't cause harm. You also need to make sure that they're healed and in a good place and beyond need so that they're comfortable, right? And I just kind of went on, and he raised his hand again and he said, but those people wouldn't even know how to read our financial reports. I said, well, it is the responsibility of the organization and the board to make sure that anybody who joins the board has, I mean, I kept saying to myself, fix your face, Tamala, just fix your face, because I show everything. Like everyone who comes onto the board should be taught how to properly look at the financial reports, because they can be overwhelming. And that may look different than what business people are used to. So we have a responsibility to make sure that all of our board members understand how to read our financial reports. Thank God he didn't ask any more, because I might have lost it. But so that's the kind of attitude, right? Does that happen in your boardroom? So what does the community think if your board doesn't represent the community? What does the community think if you're out in community talking about equity and inclusion and belonging, and they look at your board and go, wait a minute, everybody on your board is over 55 and they're white, and the majority of the people in the room are men. Where's the equity and inclusion and belonging there? Right? There's a disconnect. So you need to pay attention to that. If someone were to make assumptions about your organization's values based on the board composition, what might they think? Another really fascinating question. Look at your website and look at your board and go, how does this match our values? How well are we cultivating a deeper understanding of the community or communities that we serve to bring their perspectives, priorities, feedback into the boardroom? And again, be thoughtful how you do that so as not to cause harm. Because you don't want someone coming into your boardroom who maybe has been historically marginalized and have them hear us and them language or talking about those people, because then we're going to create more harm. So you got to do the work. Are we ever at risk of making decisions without fully understanding how these decisions may affect those we serve? What are those people doing driving that nice car coming to the food pantry? What assumptions are we making? If we were to make a deeper commitment to diversity, inclusion, and equity, what would that mean for our mission, our work, and the people we serve? Now, I'm guessing that in this room, you're probably doing a lot of this stuff thoughtfully and intentionally. Not all of your organizations are, right? But I think this is probably on the radar for a lot of you. But how this shows up in a boardroom might look really different than how it shows up with staff. It's always interesting. I said this to someone recently, that there's often, someone had asked me to come in and meet with a couple of their board members. They're thinking about engaging in some work with me, and we had to have some hard conversations. And I made the comment in that room that often the culture in the boardroom looks really different than the culture for the staff. And the board member kind of went, how could that happen? So how often do you engage with the staff? Do you understand the vision of the organization? How much do you know about the work? And they weren't sure what the answer meant, right? But that gets to a lot of this stuff. So we have to be thoughtful about those things. So once we've done our assessment, we've talked about how we're going to recruit. People have said, yes, I would love to join your board. Now what do we do with them? We have to do a board orientation. right? Make sure that your board, not a staff person, but your board has somebody assigned for the responsibility, either a person or a committee, ideally a committee, has the responsibility for board orientation. Remember, just because they've served on 7 boards doesn't mean they know what it's like to be a board member for your organization. I know I've said that 7 times already. I'll probably say it an 8th time just to make sure you remember it, so, right? Make this a structured process. If you're going to join our board, we have an orientation process, and it looks like this. Now, that can be a wide variety of things. It could be an actual formal training. It could be, we're going to put you through a brief training. Maybe we're going to walk through the last 3 to 6 months of board meeting notes and finances so that you can catch up and understand context and where we're at. Maybe you have a mentor. So someone who's been on the board for a little while and is a healthy board member, that's important, is a healthy board member, doing it right, maybe mentors and guides and says, calls them up after a board meeting. What questions do you have? Or is there anything I can help? Because sometimes we don't want to ask a question in a room because we might feel stupid. Or we might feel like, I don't know. Chances are probably 5 other people in the room have the same question, but we're afraid to ask, right? So what does that structured process look like? And it's going to be a little bit to each organization because it has to be specific to your mission. How does this connect to you as an organization? So we've done that. They're on the board. We've gone through orientation. Here's the key. You're not done yet. Ongoing training needs to be built into our systems. Build it into the existing work. Do we do an annual board retreat? Get away from things. Talk about the work. Take some time to reflect. Learn. Do we offer opportunities for board members to attend trainings? Do we provide training at a board meeting? Some of my former clients, one example was, I happened to mention a book to them when we were doing some work together. So they decided to read the book together. And every month at a board meeting, they would go through a chapter. And they would just talk about it. What questions are coming up? What are you noticing? What do we need to learn more about? What do we want to dig into? And when I worked at the Johnson Center, one of my clients told me that the Johnson Center puts out 11 trends in philanthropy every year. And they would actually use that at every board meeting. They would take a different trend. One, to talk about philanthropy, to learn about the sector, to think about what's actually happening in the world of philanthropy. So when we think about this ongoing training, it's both skill development and mission understanding. How can we be better board members? My time is going. How can we be better board members? And how do we better understand our mission? So say, for example, that you're working with people who have experienced homelessness or are experiencing homelessness. Are there laws that are shifting that are going to impact the population that our board should understand as they're making decisions? Right? So what's the mission understanding that people need? What's the skill development that people need? Do people actually know how to talk about our organization in public? Do they even know our mission? Do they understand our vision? Right? So it's our responsibility to make sure we're doing that ongoing training. Don't do it once. People forget. Do it often. Right? And make it interesting. Here's the final piece to making a board healthy. Board rotation. Lots of people argue with me about this. I'm still going to stand on this. I very strongly believe in term limits for board members. Very strongly. Why? Any thoughts?
Sometimes change is good.
Change is good. If we don't have, what was that?
It can get stale.
It can get stale. But we've always done it that way,
Yeah.
says the board member who's been on for 10 years.
New people, new ideas.
That's nice, but guess what? The world has changed. If you weren't paying attention, the world's changed a lot from last week to this week.
Yeah.
I mean, really. There used to be a term that was really common back in the 80s, and I'm hearing it resurface again now. VUCA environments. Has anybody heard that term? like volatile. Now I got to remember what it all stands for. But it's something that came out of,
Like rapid water.
yeah, it has something to do with rapid change and volatile, uncertain. Anyway, so VUCA is, I was listening to NPR last week and somebody talked about VUCA and I was like, oh, that's resurfacing. That's been a long time. You didn't hear about it a lot. So now it's resurfacing. Listen, you can look it up, VUCA. It's resurfacing, and I'm starting to hear reporters talk about we live in this VUCA environment. Huh. Which means, guess what? It changes really fast. And there's a lot of uncertainty, and it's volatile. How do we navigate that? Board rotation can be healthy to bring change. Remember, just because someone leaves your board doesn't mean they have to leave your organization. You don't bar them entry. You say, how else would you like to serve this organization? Or maybe they're just hired and they want to be done because they've been on the board for 10 years. If you don't have term limits or you maybe have them written into your bylaws and you haven't actually enforced them, it's hard to start. It feels messy, lots of tears. It's not easy. But it's important to think about bringing on different perspectives. It's important to be intentional and thoughtful about what's the next step after board service, right? So I'm curious how this aligns with your own board experiences.
I just want to make one point, even if you look at board globally,
Yes.
it's often always powerful people you find on the board. So it's easy to say that, white men are predominant, but they have the power. But
Yeah.
it's really the same thing. It's just that it's not I don't think it's necessarily a racial thing. It's just that white men in this country have the power.
Power dynamics do play a role, but part of the reason I think in the nonprofit sector we've ended up with the boards we have is for far too long we've recruited board members to raise money. Now, please hear this. Don't just listen to the first statement, listen to the second one. My first statement is a board's job is not to fundraise. I just saw a few heads go like this. A board's job is governance. Part of that duty of care is to ensure that the organization has the resources it needs to fulfill its mission. So here's the second statement. All board members should be engaged in fund development. Now I make a distinction between fundraising and fund development. Fundraising is tactical and transactional. It's all the things we do to raise money. So maybe we do a mail appeal, maybe we write a grant, maybe we do an annual fundraising event, maybe we sit down with an individual donor and ask. Good fund development says, here's all the tools in my toolkit, mail appeal, grants, events, etc. How do I map those out in a way that actually helps me build relationship with the people who support our mission and vision? That's fund development. So we can say to board members, fun exercise. If you want to do this in your boardroom next time you meet, give everybody a 3x5. I promise this is my last thing. A 3x5 index card. And say, write down, you can do 3 to 5, doesn't matter. Write down 3 to 5 things that you do to build relationship. Personally, what do you do to build relationship? What do you think people write down? Throw out some things.
Network.
We network.
Most of them.
We go to events together. Personally, what do you do to build relationship? You have coffee with people. You go out to dinner. You send birthday cards. You talk to them on the phone. You text.
You ask about their
You ask about their
likes,
life. What's
like
going
their
on?
experience.
How are things, right? We're involved. We get to know people. We all do it. We all have friends. I hope we all do it. Right? We all have friends. We network. We connect. We have dinner. We call people. So you ask them, just write down things that you do to develop relationships in your life. Personally, what do you do? Send birthday cards, whatever it is. And then have people, shout out, what do you do? And then say, guess what? you're actually doing fund development work all the time. And they'll go, no, I'm not. I didn't ask anybody for money. I didn't say you were doing fundraising. You said you were doing fund development work. Because good fund development work is about how we build relationships with people. So you could say to board members, you don't have to go out and ask anybody for money, but would you take a look at this list of our top 25 donors? Do you know anybody? Could you maybe invite them to lunch and I, as executive director or development director or whatever, could come along? Oh, and by the way, so it is not a burden on the organization, would you mind buying lunch? That's not that hard. What are we going to talk about at lunch? I would love for said board member to talk about why they're involved in the organization. Use your testimony. Give me a chance to get to know this person and maybe hear why they care about community. So I can listen well and figure out how to connect. That's fund development work. Oh, by the way, board members, I would love it if we would take 15 minutes at the next board meeting. Everybody, please bring some stamps with you. We're going to have note cards. We're going to give you a list of 5 people. Write a thank you note and just let them know how much you appreciate the fact that they continue to engage in our mission. We don't have to say anything about how much money they gave. We don't have to say any of that. Just love on them. Let them know we appreciate them. And if we have a really low budget and we don't have a lot of extra money for stamps, bring 5 stamps with you so you can address the envelope and put the stamp on it, and we'll drop them in the mail on our way home. That's fund development work. But if you tell someone you have to fundraise, I need you to fill a whole table. I need you to buy a table. Oh, I need you to sell tickets for that. Oh, I need you to go out and ask that person for money. Most people are, It's scary. And not everybody is equipped to do that. And that's okay. So I'll say it again. Your board's job is not fundraising. They're a governance body. That's their job. And a board should engage in fund development.
We got some online questions.
Yeah.
Just a few general ones. How many board members are required to be in a nonprofit in Michigan?
I think the state of Michigan requires 3, which is also the federal requirement from the IRS.
Can you still run your nonprofit without a full board? I understand that you can, but you cannot hold a board meeting.
That depends on how your bylaws are written. Never put our board should be X number of people in your bylaws. Always put a range because you don't want to get yourself in a situation where you can't do legal business. So it depends how your bylaws are written. If your bylaws state we must have a minimum of 3, which the law requires, and no more than 15, and you have 5 board members, if you have a quorum of those 5 based on how your bylaws are written, you can still do board business.
Do you have suggestions how to run a nonprofit if it is difficult to fill a board position and find someone that understands the culture or has lived experiences?
Oh, I have lots. Email me.
Okay, that'd be fine. Last question here. Do you have a suggestion on how a minority founder of a nonprofit who serves as executive director maintains a position? I'm a representative with lived experience for the population that I serve. I am afraid of having my board members who do not understand the culture or has real lived experience vote me out because they think they know better on what our population needs and have the board experience and privilege.
Which is a real concern for a founder. Most founders populate their first board with friends and family and their bubbleheads. And they always say yes. When we start growing up and maturing, we tend to bring other people from the community into our boardrooms. And if we're not thoughtful and careful, A, about how we're recruiting, B, about what's the education. So I would say in that instance, that individual needs to do some education. If that's a fear, that tells me the board hasn't been well educated. So do some education first. And again, email me. I'm happy to have a deeper conversation. But do some education first. And I'm easy to find. Tamala, it's long, but the Intentional Catalyst is very easy to remember. TheIntentionalCatalyst.com. So it's Tamala at TheIntentionalCatalyst.com.
We'll share and
Easy to
follow
find.
up.
She'll share and follow up. So in that case, this is a real thing, right? Once your what you have to understand as a founder of an organization, your board has the power to fire you.
Queued up.
I just heard a uh-oh. Right? They do. That board represents the community, which means you better be really thoughtful about how you educate that board if they don't understand the lived experience, right? You have to help educate them, do some training, help them learn about the lived experience, tell stories. So one of the do I have time for a quick story?
It's up to these guys. Yeah.
So I'm gonna tell you a personal story. My last executive director position was a social service agency, and so we had a big, huge food pantry. We had financial assistance. We had lots of different programs going on in our facility, and this was a particular board where I was carrying a lot of us in them language when I started. And I remember one night being in the boardroom. And I was fairly new, so I felt like I could get away with it. And I was hearing this us and them language, and somebody made, and I wrote up on the whiteboard in the boardroom, I said, what do you think of when you hear the term poverty or poor? And I heard all kinds of things: uneducated, lazy, doesn't work. Like, what the normal things, right? Normal. That's what everybody says. That's what everybody thinks. What are those myths? And I said, what would you think? You know, people who live on assistance, blah, blah, blah. The list was long. I said, what would you think if I told you that I know of a client that comes into our pantry regularly and has a doctorate degree? Mm-hmm. And because of a health issue can no longer work and can't quite make ends meet with Social Security. I said, what would you say of a single mother who has a full-time job and a house and is raising 2 kids and can't quite make ends meet and needs SNAP benefits? And I went on and I told a pretty detailed story about some experiences of this single mom who had lost a home and various other things that went on, all while working, college educated, 3 degrees. And the board got really quiet. And I said, what would you think if I told you that single mom was me? Dead silence in the room. And I said, that was my story before I came to work here. So pay attention to the assumptions you make. Had you known that about me, would you have hired me for this job? So when you make an assumption about someone who walks through our doors, think of me. Dead silence. Right? I had a story. I have lived experience for the people who are walking through our door every day. Nobody on my board did. So I had to help them learn what that looked like. They were shocked when I told my story, but it also shifted something for them. Because what are the assumptions that we make? And we don't know the stories of people who walk in our doors. So for that young executive, afraid that their board's going to fire them because they don't understand, teach them, tell the story, help them see it. Every board member needs to have an experience of your mission. Now you might say, well, we work with immigrants and they've not been an immigrant. That's okay. Can they have an experience of that? How do you teach them? How do you help them feel that? How do you help them understand what someone goes through? Put them in a situation of being uncomfortable and let them marinate in that for a minute. Because that's how we learn. So I will end with that.